my special pleasure to introduce Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google and emeritus professor from Berkeley. He's a distinguished economist, a member of AAAS, editor of a variety of journals. I think the most distinctive thing about his long career is he's both made tremendous contributions to economic theory and also great contributions to communicating those ideas, both through very popular textbooks, a best-selling book, Information Rules, which is one of my very favorite books, as well as a column that he published for a while in the New York Times. He told me he had 100 of those published communicating these ideas. And now he's at Google looking at a variety of more practical problems and theoretical problems. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. So I want to talk about some work I've been doing at Google. You know, we have this 20% project. So this is kind of my 20% project where we're trying to use Google data for looking at economic data. And they say prediction is hard, especially about the future, so we've lowered the bar a little bit, and our goal is to try to predict the present. But that's pretty good too, because a lot of data is released with long lags, monthly data, quarterly data, and so getting a better idea of what's going on now turns out to be quite helpful. And I want to point out this work is joint work with a couple of people on my team at Google, Han-Young Choi and Steve Scott. So we're going to start out with a quiz. I think this audience is quite appropriate for this question. Which day of the week are there the most searches for hangover? That's the question. So this is interactive. I want you to raise your hand. How many people say Sunday? Okay. How many people say Monday? Yeah. How many people say Tuesday? Yeah, we got a party animal up here. So, well, the answer, it turns out, is Sunday. That's good. And how do we tell? Well, we go to this tool that Google provides called Google Insights for Search. There's also a tool called Google Trends, which is basically a simplified front end for the same data set. And here you'll see I typed the word hangover in here. I said I want to look at web search. I want to do the United States. I want to look at December 2008 to February 2009. And I get this very, very regular pattern. If this were live, you could look at the dates. Turns out those peaks are every Sunday. And what's the big spike? That's January 1st. Okay? So something you already know. One little point that I want to emphasize is that there's also a classification. It says that query, hangover, fits in the food and drink category, the health category, well, I guess so, entertainment, and so on. And up here, there's a little link that says download a CSV file. So you could pull this data down and merge it with your own data for other purposes. If you scroll down the screen a little bit, you see a geo. We find out that hangover, the hangover capital of the US is New York. We all knew that, I'm sure, followed by Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, etc. And up here in the Bible Belt, there are very few queries on hangover. I don't know if that's because they don't have hangovers or they're just much more stoic than no broadband or the rest of the people. And here you could look at the top searches: hangover cures, etc., and hangover. What's that last one? Best hangover cure. So you can see all sorts of information about that topic. Now, you can also compare searches. So here I've compared hangover and vodka down here, and if you look at it, you can see it. It's off by 1 day. So what happens is vodka queries peak every Saturday, hangover queries peak every Sunday, and that big spike is December 31st, as you might well guess. You could do this yourself. There's this thing called the internet, and Google provides this. Anyway, so what happens is some people say, wait, but there are many more searches for vodka than for hangover. And of course, not every vodka turns into hangover. I estimate the gap between those lines is about 4 shots is my, my estimate. All right, so you get the idea. You can get these very, very regular patterns, and indeed, is kind of a trivial point, but indeed searches for vodka are to some degree a predictor, a leading indicator, you might say, in searches for hangover, okay? Now, there are other things, there are other kind of fun and games you can play with this. Here's a picture of searches for Civil War in the United States. So it's just that term, Civil War. And if you look at that series, you are struck, I think, by the fact that it is phenomenally regular, okay? So if I fit a little statistical model, it's what's called seasonal autoregressive model, where I say the searches this week are A plus B times the searches 52 weeks ago, then it turns out you can predict the searches this week on Civil War with fantastic degree of accuracy. So the question for the crowd is why? Why is it such a regular pattern? Well, it turns out that this peak right here, that's 2 days before the term paper's due. So if you look at this, take any academic subject, ribosome, Civil War, you know, Henry VIII, I don't care, you'll see a very, very regular pattern because those topics tend to be introduced at particular points during the semester. And how do I know that it's just a few days before the paper's due? Here is a comparison of searches on Civil War and searches on term paper. It was a little hard to see in the graph, but they have essentially the same cyclic behavior, and that works for pretty much anything you will put in a term paper, okay? All right, so you can see there's a lot of very, very predictable stuff going on in terms of these queries, and the goal is to try to do for vodka and hangovers and term papers and Civil Wars what for economic data. So what I want to do is I want to take some economic index or indicator and try to build a model which will forecast typically contemporaneous values of that indicator using the data that's available in the Google Search Insights or Google Trends database. I want to emphasize that kids, you can try this at home. All the data I'm working with is public data, so you can just download the stuff from Google. You can look at your indicator of interest and see how well you can build a model. But there are some tricks to the trade, so I want to discuss some of the pitfalls and some of the right ways and wrong ways that you might do this. There are 2 research papers. One is Predicting the Present with Google Trends and Predicting Initial Claims for Unemployment Benefits. So here's my recommended procedure for using that data is start out by fitting the best model you can using the data you have. And in many cases, that'll just be the past value, the time series itself. We saw in those cases it had a lot of very, very high seasonality. So obviously searches a week ago in one case or 52 weeks ago in the other case would be helpful in predicting the current value. And sometimes there'll be trends in the data. We didn't see too much in those cases, but with the trends, you can try to model that trend behavior as well. Then you add in the Google data, the Search Insights data, as an additional predictor, and you look at how much you improve your prediction. And the recommended way to do that is to look at the 1 step ahead forecast error. So estimate up the time t, forecast t plus 1, compare the estimates with and without that Google predictor, and see how well you can predict the series in terms of something. Mean absolute error is what I tend to use, but you could use other measures of fit. And I will say that turning points are particularly interesting in an economic context, because if a series goes like this or a series goes like this, it's pretty easy to forecast. It's this stuff that's hard to forecast when it's changing direction or changing how it's moving. Now, there are some issues here. The economic data is released typically on a monthly or sometimes even quarterly basis, and the Google data is available on a daily or weekly basis. That's really a plus because you can get advanced warning of what might be happening, but you do have to deal with what is called mixed frequency estimation. You have high frequency observations, you're trying to predict some low frequency data. What you see in those charts is not a raw number, but an index. So it's the normalized query share. And what do I mean by that? Well, the series you saw for hangover was queries on hangover divided by total number of queries for that geo and that period, and then normalized to equal 100 at the maximum point in the series. So it's a normalized query share, and it uses broad match because hangover matched hangovers, hangover cure, all that stuff. So it's something where it had a fairly loose definition of matching. You have to have around 50 observations to appear in the data at all. That's for privacy reasons. Actually, it has to be 50 observations from distinct IP addresses because we didn't want really idiosyncratic stuff. It's generally going to be popular topics. It's sampled data. This is a concern for people sometimes. The way it works is if you do one of the searches on Google Trends, you get the chart back, you do it again, 10 minutes later you get the same numbers because it caches the results for each day. But if you do it the next day, it'll be different by a few percent, just small sampling variation because to make it real time it had to be sampling. And then finally you can look at a session context, which is quite important because there's a lot of disambiguation challenges here. For example, Apple. Do I mean Apple as in food and drink, or do I mean Apple as in consumer electronics? And they behave in a completely different way. The top line is Apple in the context of food and drink, which peaks every November, not too surprising. And then the bottom line is Apple in the context of consumer electronics, which peaks around Christmas time because it's a popular present, and then it also peaks when there's new product announcements. Okay? So there's a fairly big distinction in terms of this kind of contextual searching, and there are a lot of things like jobs. I mean, do you mean jobs as in labor, or do you mean jobs as in Steve Jobs? So there's a lot of cases where there's ambiguity that you're not really aware of until you start looking at the data. Okay, so I think, oh yeah, one last thing, you can also look at searches by category alone. So here in this particular case, I've chosen as the category, which is right up, is that showing up? Yeah, vehicle shopping. And we see this series here for vehicle shopping. Big jump in the summer of 2009. That was this program called Cash for Clunkers, which excited a lot of interest. In fact, I got a call from some of the people, economists in the federal government. They were trying to look at the economic impact of Cash for Clunkers. And as everybody would recognize, there's a certain amount of intertemporal substitution. That if you knew there was going to be a sale on cars, you'd delay some purchases beforehand, and then afterwards you expect to see that there was a dip in the sales. And indeed, if you look at this chart, you can see exactly that there are fewer sales than you would have expected beforehand. You also can look and find out when people first became aware of the program by searching for the exact term, Cash for Clunkers. So those are all my fun examples. And what I want to talk about now is how you use this in economics. So we're going to look at questions involving unemployment. Now, there's a couple different measures of unemployment. The thing that you see a lot reported in the paper is the unemployment rate, which is a survey where they call people up and say, are you anybody in your household out of work and looking for work? And there's also something called the initial claims for unemployment benefits. And the initial claims for unemployment benefits is that when somebody becomes unemployed, they go down to the office and they file a claim to receive unemployment benefits. And if you were to become unemployed, the first thing you might ask is, well, where is that unemployment office anyway? And so how would you find out? Well, you'd go to Google and type in, where's the unemployment office? How do I file for unemployment benefits? How much are unemployment benefits? How long do they last? There'd be lots of questions that you might ask about that particular program. Now, this is a chart that shows in black the initial claims for unemployment and shows in red the unemployment rate. it goes from the mid-60s. The gray bars are recessions. And one thing I want to point out in this diagram is first that the initial claims for unemployment peak right at the end of every recession. So that's the best single indicator for the end of a recession, when the initial claims for unemployment rate peak. And you might say, wow, that's amazing, but I do have to tell you that economists get to define when the end of a recession is. And one of the things they look at is initial claims for unemployment. So there's a little circularity there. It's not exactly a purely scientific fact. But the other point, which is also interesting, is that if you look at the gap between the peak in initial claims and the peak in the unemployment rate, peak in the unemployment rate is later, used to be fairly close, and in the last few recessions it's been roughly 12 months afterwards. So you think about it, initial claims are like water pouring into the sink. You've got people getting jobs, that's water running out of the sink, and then the level of water in the sink, that's the unemployment. And so it's not too surprising that when you change the rate at which the water is flowing in, you're not going to see that showing up in the unemployment rate until a little later. Okay, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting to be able to predict this initial claims to unemployment, and every Thursday at 8 or 8:30 a.m., the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases this number. And I guess today's Thursday, released it this morning. It was very good news because economists were expecting it to change by about 3,000 people. It changed by 15,000, went down by 15,000. So that's quite a positive indicator. Okay, so the question is, what about Google Search Insights? Well, if you just go look at those categories, this is a picture of what queries look like for welfare and unemployment. And you can see, indeed, in 2008, when the recession was getting underway, we saw a significant increase in queries on that topic. A few of the other categories that are relevant was jobs, job, resume, salary, career. So that's the jobs category. That's all about how people get jobs, cover letter, employment, interviews, salary, etc. And then the welfare and unemployment, which has to do with unemployment claims, welfare, Social Security, and then job listings, which is mostly temp jobs. It's the other side of the labor market. So those would be relevant categories for looking at this initial claims for unemployment. And of course, you could also look at individual queries. So here in the top chart, I've got the initial claims to unemployment for unemployment benefits, which is the black line, and then the blue line is searches in that welfare and unemployment category. And then down below is, in fact, the initial claims for unemployment along with the query file for unemployment. All right? So a query fragment, maybe. They might say unemployment benefits or unemployment payments or something, but just file for unemployment gives you a fairly good alignment with that series. So it's not too surprising. There might at least be contemporaneous predictors. Yes?
So it seems like they're the same except when they're different.
Yeah.
There's an explanation for some of the significant
Well, you see, there is this thing that people, when a topic gets to be interesting, people say, type in queries like, how many people file for unemployment? Or, so it wouldn't be the direct filings for unemployment, which would be there, but it would be potentially the repercussions of that on other things. So you do have to watch out for that. So they're not perfect, they're not perfectly aligned, absolutely, but still it's fairly clear that the two series are related. Okay, so what you can do is just a simple regression, and I take as my baseline model just trying to forecast the initial claims for unemployment based on previous values of the initial claims for unemployment. And if you just do that, so the model turns out to be almost a random walk. For a random walk, the best forecast of tomorrow is today, and you get an in-sample mean absolute error of about 3.27%. If we add in that filing for unemployment query as an additional predictor, the mean absolute error goes to about 3.17, so the mean absolute error is going down. Of course, that's just in-sample measurements, so those aren't really the best thing in terms of forecasting. What you want to do is you want to look at the out-of-sample forecast. So if you train the data for using t weeks and then forecast t plus 1, it turns out the baseline is about 3.3% mean absolute error. And when you add in the query, you get about a 3% improvement. But when you look during the recession, which is the really interesting part, when you've got the action going on, there it turns out the mean absolute of the baseline is about 3.98%. With the query, it's 3.6%. So you get about a 9% improvement in your one step ahead out-of-sample forecast. Now I want to make clear that you understand the definition of forecast here. I'm doing a contemporaneous forecast. So I'm looking at the queries this week, the initial claims last week to forecast the initial claims this week. But those initial claims are not going to be released until next week. So basically, you're doing a week ahead forecast of the contemporaneous information. And what you're saving here is that there's this compilation lag of roughly a week to pull the data together for the official statistics. And here we've got real-time data from the Google queries. All right, and there's a little picture of what the red line, the black line's the truth, the red line is the baseline forecast of just forecasting this week based on last week, and then the green line is adding in that additional data. And basically the action comes up here around the turning point when we're actually seeing the initial claims peak, which is the most interesting period. All right, so that's one example. Here's another little example on destination planning. This is data from travel to Hong Kong. So it turns out the Hong Kong Tourism Board posts monthly summaries of visitors from different countries, about a 1-month lag. And in the Google Trends travel category, it turns out we have Hong Kong as a specific vacation destination. So this would be queries like Hong Kong hotels, where to eat in Hong Kong, airport transportation, Hong Kong, that kind of thing. If you plot the data, the Google Search Insights data, along with the actual arrivals, so this is for US, Canada, Great Britain, and so on, you can see there's some similarities there. So it's pretty clear these data has something to do with each other. And if you build a little model, so here would be about the simplest model you could build, it would be called a seasonal autoregressive model, where you say the arrivals in week T depend on the arrivals in week T minus 1. Sorry, I said week T, I should say month T, depend on the arrivals last month plus a weighted input from the arrivals 12 months ago, plus the Google query activity on this. So that gives you a forecast about 6 weeks in advance of the data release. I look at this 2 weeks into the month. So I've got the month, and then there's a month lag in them getting the data out. So we're looking at a forecast roughly 6 weeks ahead of when the data is actually released, and 2 weeks ahead before the end of the month. So it turns out when you do that, you get this really very strong relationship. Summary so far, we've got hundreds of category predictors. I think there are about 600. We've got millions of query predictors, tens and hundreds of millions for that matter, because there are all those different queries. And in general, if you look at most of these economic series, you'll get maybe a 5%, 10% improvement in forecast error, out-of-sample forecast error by using the data. And of course, it's very, very easy to acquire and work with. It's just a click away, as we say. So this brings up some methodological questions. How should you select predictors? How should you make their forecasts? How should you evaluate the performance? And how do you deal with this mixed frequency estimation? So there's a number of different topics that arise once you have this question. All right, so here's the patron saint of economics and computer science, Herb Simon. He had this wonderful quote back in 1971, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." and a need to allocate that attention among this overabundance of information. Well, we kind of think of that from a information overload perspective, but that's also a very nice challenge for econometrics. It used to be we had to scrabble for every little data series, and you had very small number of observations, and we're trying to deal with that situation. Well, now it's quite the opposite. We have millions and millions of possible predictors, and the challenge is how do we use those in an effective way. So, many people in this audience are familiar with various kinds of machine learning, cross-sectional prediction, and so on. But time series is different, and it's different for several reasons. One is, it's not a big data problem, it's a small data problem. If you look at the number of observations in the time series, in our case, the Google data starts in January 1, 2004, so we've only got about 90, 95 observations on most of these series. Now we have lots and lots of predictors, but we don't have very much that we're trying to predict. And you really can't get more data because the economic data is what it is. I mean, it goes back to a certain time, and if it's monthly frequency, you're kind of stuck with monthly frequency. In many cases, the structure evolves over time. So if you think about consumer electronics, maybe that's a category of consumption for 1955, but obviously that's a completely different category of consumption for 2012. And you might expect that the relationship between these economic variables could be different over time, and you'd like to have something that allows for that. It's definitely not IID, independent, identically distributed data, because the past values of a particular series are, in general, highly predictive for that series. You saw that in the seasonal data, so what happened a year ago, or a week ago, or a month ago, whatever, is predictive for what's happening now or what will happen next month. So you have to look at that trend and seasonality issue. And the baseline for comparing predictions is quite different. If you look at cross-sectional estimation, you might compare it to using a constant. Now, R squared is looking at the sum of squared residuals compared to a constant. Time series, you generally want to compare to some simple autoregressive model, like the models I just showed you. What would prediction be like if you only looked at past values of the series itself, for example? Things like cross-validation, which is a very powerful tool for doing cross-sectional estimation. It's very tricky in this context because of the fact that past values are predictive. So you can't just throw them out and say how well you could do. You're losing some of your best predictors. But you can use this kind of moving window where you're saying, I want to estimate up to t and then forecast some number of periods into the future. And finally, the last thing is that for economic data in particular, that there's very, very high contemporaneous correlation among the series. So there isn't a single best model. In many cases, there would be a set of variables that would be equally predictive of whatever it is you're trying to forecast, because so many things move together. And so you have to expect a lot of ties. So there's a term in economics popularized with a lot of work done by David Hendry and his collaborators, Jennifer Castle, Jürgen Dornick at Oxford, and they emphasize the same set of issues that I just described, namely contemporaneous forecasting. How do you update those forecasts as new information becomes available? What do you do for variable selection and so on? And I would say they've really paved the way in looking at this set of issues. Variable selection is a particularly important area, as we'll see later on. And there's been work in economics examining many different methods for variable selection, like using judgment, penalized fit, one form or another, Bayesian selection models, machine learning techniques, significance testing, all sorts of different ways to do this variable selection. And of course, there are many applications in a variety of areas. I'm going to focus on economics, but this issue is coming up more and more as we have more data-rich environments. Okay, So one challenge is what you might call fat regressions. You know, when you're looking at a regression, you're trying to predict something, and you have a limited number of possible predictors. Well, with a fat regression, you could have millions of possible predictors. And the problem is you can always fit n observations with n predictors, and even if you have fewer than n predictors, you could get a good fit just by chance alone. There's also a phenomenon known, particularly in time series, as spurious regression, where correlation can arise simply because of common seasonality or common trends. Finally, there's this problem of overfitting, which is related to the first point, that usually smaller models perform better for out-of-sample prediction than very large models. So these are things that come up, and people who work in this area are quite familiar with these problems. The fat regression, so the usual regression is I'm trying to predict something y, and maybe I have a matrix of predictors, not very many predictors compared to the number of observations. With a fat regression, I have potentially millions of predictors, like in this like in the Google Trends example. And so any square subset fits perfectly. You just have to solve n equations and n unknowns. And some subset of predictors, well, if you get to choose out of those millions, then you could just have a subset that happens to be correlated with what you're trying to predict. So it looks great in sample, but does poor out of sample. I like this term, fat regression. I used to call it horizontal regression, but fat is a better term. Here's a nice recipe for spurious regression. How do you get a high R squared? So take two heapings of white noise. So just throw in a bunch of white noise. Obviously, they have nothing to do with each other. Add in a common trend. So add to that noise a common growth rate. And then add in common seasonality. And what do you know? If you add together the trend plus the seasonality plus the white noise, you get two series that look very highly correlated. You run your regression, and then you should run right out and submit your paper because you found this fundamental relationship. So that's a big danger in lots of fields, that just a common trend or common seasonality can make things look like they're related when they really aren't.
Does this happen a lot? Do people draw false conclusions by...
Right. So what happens is, of course, people who are knowledgeable, this is a well-known pitfall, but which doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does happen occasionally. And of course, one of the things you try to do when you teach statistics or econometrics is you try to get students to fall into this at least once in their life so they know that they shouldn't do it in the future. But it happens more than it should, but it definitely is well known as a problem. Yes?
It's a problem per se if what you're trying to do is predict the economic indicator, and there happens to be a common seasonality with the Google searches. Why is that?
Let me go on for my next couple of slides, and I think I'm going to answer your question, and if I don't, ask it again. All right? So, in fact, I think I'm going to answer it in the very next two slides. Example, retail sales. So that's the total value sales in a given month is calculated by the, I think the Bureau of Economic Analysis calculates this. So up at the top, I show you the raw data, the non-seasonally adjusted data. And you can see it has a very prominent pattern of it peaks every Christmas season, okay? So it's got a very, very strong seasonality here. And you can see there is this kind of drop here, but it becomes much more apparent if we look at the deseasonalized data. All right, so we've corrected the data, the seasonally adjusted data here, where they've taken out that common effect of peaking every Christmas. And what do we see? We see the impact of the recession, this huge drop because of the recession. Now, if you try to build a little model using the Search Insights data to predict these two different series, well, the natural thing to do is to try to use seasonally adjusted data to predict the seasonally adjusted series, and the non-seasonally adjusted or raw data to predict the raw series, and you get completely different predictors. Because what will happen is a predictor of the non-seasonally adjusted data, the biggest one turns out to be apparel, okay? So this is showing you the mean value of that predictor in a model. I'm going to tell you where this came from later. Right now it's kind of a black box. But the probability that apparel should be in the model for predicting retail sales is about 83%, so it's a very strong predictor. And let me just finish this. And then on the other hand, the predictors of the seasonally adjusted retail sales, they're things like coupons and rebates, bankruptcy, welfare and unemployment, and so on, because the salient point in this second case is that recession. And the things I showed you as predictors were all things that move during the recession. Whereas the salient point of the first series is that strong seasonality, things that peak every Christmas. And so it's going to find things that peak every Christmas to try to predict that series. But that's not very interesting. We know it peaks every Christmas, okay? So you can predict the series just as well using its own past values as using this additional predictor of apparel. The interesting case is the second case, the case with the seasonally adjusted data. And just to drive that home, here's what the retail sales, non-seasonally adjusted, and apparel data look like, and my method, my black box method that I haven't explained yet, is picking out something that spikes every Christmas, which is queries on apparel. All right? But here's the other case, which is the seasonally adjusted retail data, and here it's picking out as its best predictor queries on coupons and sales, and basically price-sensitive queries, because when the economy heads south, people are trying to save money and they're doing more queries on coupons and other price-sensitive topics, okay? So it's what you're really interested, I would say, is not the first part. You knew that already. What you're interested in is the second part, the fact that these other topics are correlated with the retail sales.
But I mean, really what matters is what you're trying to predict.
It's very fair. The question, what he said to us, what matters is what you're trying to predict. And indeed, if you were interested in predicting just the raw data, then you might want to use the non-seasonally adjusted predictor. Even there, you can kind of make a case that the seasonality might be distracting you from the really important thing, so that, in fact, you might want to do something where you estimate the seasonally adjusted model first and then add on the seasonal effect. So it depends on what you're trying to do. Okay, but you get the distinction. And here, for example, if I take another Google tool called Google Correlate, and with Google Correlate, you can feed in any time series you want, and it will find the queries that are the most highly correlated with that series. It will only do this, it's only meaningful for the non-seasonally adjusted data, because it's using the raw query numbers, no seasonal adjustment. If I feed in the non-seasonally adjusted retail sales, what I get out is Party Source, which turns out to be a party store in Kentucky. I think they really must know how to party there in Kentucky, because it's a very, very, and this is a picture of it. This is how correlated it is with the retail sales. And then everything else is a mall. Coral Square, Suburban Square, Pines Mall, Burbank Mall, Rolling Oaks, Chula Vista, and it goes on and on. If you keep looking at more correlates, the queries that are most correlated with just the raw retail sales data are malls, which perhaps isn't too surprising, but it's not really very insightful, because it may help you a lot if you're just interested in predicting retail sales unadjusted, but what we're usually interested in, I would claim, is the adjusted data. All right, so we care about the incremental value of possible predictors. How much better can you do with a given predictor than by only using the past value of the series? Another example is good predictor of auto sales turns out to be baseball, because they both peak in the summer and they're low in the winter. But that's not much of an insight from an economic point of view. And so what happens in the time series literature is the usual recommendation is to what they call whiten or pre-whiten the series. You pull out the predictable components, which could be seasonal or it could be detrending. That's another topic. Try to pull out what is predictable from the series alone, and then try to estimate how much predictive power you can get on top of that once you've pulled out the predictable part of the series. So in a regression context, you think that X might have something to do with Y. What you should do is run your favorite univariate time series model on Y for predicting Y from its own past values. Run your favorite model on X, predicting X from its own past values. And then you look at the unpredicted component. Do innovations, do departures from this typical pattern for X, are they associated with departures in the typical pattern for Y? And that's going to be generally the best methodology for trying to see whether you really have predictive power. And a slightly more sophisticated version of what I just said is something that in statistics or economics is called Granger causality. It's not really about causality, it's about predictability. Once you've pulled out the univariate predictive components of the series, does the other series help predict the innovations? All right, so I mentioned Google Correlate. This is a screenshot of it, and what I've done here is I've loaded in the initial claims for unemployment non-seasonally adjusted, so just the raw data. And what does it turn out that the most highly correlated query is? It turns out it's sign up for unemployment. And after that, Idaho unemployment, Michigan unemployment, unemployment filing, all things that are very closely related to unemployment. About halfway through the list, you get the Jack LaLanne juicer. I don't know why the Jack LaLanne juicer is highly correlated with initial claims to unemployment. Maybe it's watching TV, I'm not sure. But generally, these tend to be pretty good. It's fun to play around with Google Correlate, because you get a lot of noise, but every now and then you get really quite a striking signal. And this is what it looks like. There's the initial claims versus this sign up for unemployment. This is just the output of Google Correlate. Okay, let's see. All right, give you another example. Unemployment forecasting. So before I was talking about initial claims for unemployment benefits. Now I want to go back and look at that monthly number of where they do a survey and they see whether people are unemployed. You could take that series, feed it into Google Correlate, find the 1,000 queries from Google Correlate that have the highest correlation with the unemployment rate, and then you can try to see, are those predictive of the actual unemployment rate? Now, important fact you should know, we looked at this in 2009, the unemployment rate among young men was about 20% during that period in the United States. All right, so you look at those queries, and just with judgment, I mean, just as a human being, you can look at that and say, hey, there's a whole bunch of queries involving the labor market, companies that are hiring, jobs, who's hiring, Department of Labor, unemployment eligibility, a bunch of things that are labor market related queries. You look a little further, you'll see a lot of queries in new tech trends like iPod digitizer, iPod apps, netbooks, free apps, free ringtones. If you're unemployed, free, that's a really good word. Because here people got some time on their hands, are looking for new gadgets. And as the summer wears on and you still don't get a job, then there are things like guitar scales for beginners, poker hand order, home workout routines, American Film Institute, top 100 films. So what is unemployment? It's unwanted leisure, right? So you're looking for things that'll fill in your leisure time activity. And since 20% of these people are young men, you won't be surprised to find a lot of queries on, well, porn tube, jailbait teens, all sorts of things like that. And this last list is not shorter than the others, it's just been more heavily censored than the others. So, you know, the idle mind is the devil's playground, blah, blah. So, in fact, when they have time on their hands, they're looking for all sorts of things like that. And in fact, the kind of ironic part is that these entertainment and adult-related queries are more highly correlated with the unemployment rate than the labor market-related queries. All right, so if you just look at the correlation between the unemployment rate aggregated of these keywords groups, there's entertainment on the left, and there's adult in the middle, there's labor market. Actually, those queries, which are kind of how to fill up leisure time, end up being quite highly correlated with unemployment. Not too surprising in retrospect. And in fact, if you try to predict unemployment, you could do the really naive thing of just pick the most highly correlated queries and throw them into some model to try to predict unemployment, and you do terribly. I mean, it ends up being about a 20% mean absolute error. If you choose the labor market related queries and you throw them into regression, then you do okay, you get about a 5% error. So in fact, what happens is your judgment is doing better than just choosing the naive correlations, which is kind of good news for economists. At least I like to think of it that way. But that really doesn't scale. So your problem is simple correlation doesn't work very well, and human judgment doesn't scale very well. So the question is, can you find a more sophisticated system for utilizing this data that's kind of machine assisted to give you good predictors? So remember, the problems are we got to correct for this common seasonality and trend issue, so do some kind of whitening on the data. We have to worry about this fat regression issue. We have many, many, many possible predictors, and sometimes you'll get predictions by chance alone. And then what we really care about is the incremental predictability. How much better can we do with these predictors than we could do with using just a naive autoregressive model or some other naive model? Here's how we approach it. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying this is the only way. I think this is a very interesting topic for research, and I'm sure there are other ways to do this. But what we did is we tried to split the problem into the time series part, where you're doing this seasonal and trend extrapolation. And for that, we use something called a Kalman filter, which is a way of getting a conditional forecast for tomorrow based on the past history. It's very nice way to express the problem. Usually you can examine the time series as a trend plus seasonal plus noise component and figure out how to predict using that. And that's a flexible model. It's adaptive, so that as the structure changes a bit, the model will change as well. And it handles non-stationarity. So in kind of traditional approaches, if you see something that's growing, you always have to sort of take out the trend by hand and then estimate the model. In this case, with the Kalman filters, it all just happens magically. So it's a nice way to do the univariate part. And then what about the regression part of how do we get these, put these extra variables in there? Well, we use something called a spike and slab regression. And the way that works is the spike is there's some prior probability that the variable is in the regression, and then conditional on being in, there's a prior probability that could take on different values, and you could write down the likelihood function for this and end up with a posterior probability that the variable's in the model, and then conditional on being in the model, we can look at the conditional probability that it takes on different values. So it's a very nice technique, and it combines quite neatly with this Kalman part, because they're both Bayesian. I mean, they don't have to be viewed in that way, but they both are naturally viewed as a Bayesian model. And then finally, in the process of doing this calculation, you're looking at lots of different possible models, and so your actual prediction ends up being a weighted average of those possible models, where the weights are given by the posterior probability, which is sometimes called Bayesian model averaging. The Kalman filter kind of handles the spurious regression because it's taking out the predictable part of the time series, the univariate part. Spike and slab, that handles the variable selection. The model averaging tends to avoid the overfitting. The fat regression, it's still a little bit of the problem because you still have many, many more predictors than what you're trying to predict, but you could do a two-stage process where you choose a set of attractive predictors and then sort of throw everything else out, choose a prior probability of 0 that it's in the regression, and you can deal with that as well. This is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. It's monthly data. It's based on calling people up. I think there are about 4,000 people in the sample. and they asked them very specific questions about consumer sentiment. Is this a good time to look for a job? Is this a good time to buy a car? You know, this kind of stuff. And they turn out this index. So we're going to select the predictors using the spike and slab with about 157 Google economic verticals. I'm going to do this using the average value for the first 2 weeks of the month, which is about 3 weeks before the data is actually released. And of course, if you just look at this data, you can see it was trundling along, took a big drop during the recession, came back, and then took a big drop in August of 2011. That was not associated with an economic event. That was, well, it was kind of. It was the, seems to be associated with the budget extension debates in Congress, which I think were depressing to lots of observers in the country, but they really, consumer sentiment really took a big hit. I throw it into this black box. Here are the predictors of consumer sentiment. Top, I mean, they all have a different probability, so the list goes on, but the top 7. Number 1 was reproductive health. The next 3, though, are really easy. Trucks and SUVs, those are positively associated with the consumer sentiment. And motorcycles and hybrid and alternative vehicles, those are negatively associated. Well, that's all the price of gasoline. And then retirement and pension plans, obviously, makes sense there. Currency and foreign exchange, cruises and charters, those happen to be other variables. And as I say in this, there's lots of ties. You can get slightly different sets of variables, but the automobile stuff always shows up there, one form or another, and the reproductive health shows up pretty strongly. So what is that all about? Well, I have to say I was mystified, and then about 2 weeks after we did this, I saw this report from the Pew Foundation that birth rates have declined really quite dramatically due to the recession. And this was a study, you can go look it up, where 2007 hit a high of 4.3, and it looks now that it's about 4. There are lots and lots of people who quite naturally are saying, well, you're unemployed, or where, you know, things are rough, let's just delay having that baby for a month or year or whatever. And it's a pretty strong phenomenon. And in fact, if you go dig into that category of reproductive health, turns out the biggest subcategory is birth control, and it's really quite amazing. The top part is consumer sentiment. The next one is reproductive health. The third one is birth control, which is a subcategory of reproductive health. And you can see how it goes down, 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 less and less interest in birth control up until January 2000 and, I can't even read it from here. January 2008, and then all of a sudden people start getting interested in it. So it's really was quite striking, and to me, really quite unexpected. I didn't expect to see that relationship at all, but it does seem to be that the consumer sentiment and the family planning kind of component of that is quite prominent. It isn't just Google. There's lots and lots of companies that have real-time data. You can go to MasterCard and buy their spending pulse data, which gives you daily charges on MasterCard by vertical, by region. Visa, MasterCard, American Express, UPS, and FedEx have all this data about things that are shipped. Walmart, Target, everybody has a supermarket scanning system. And I should say Yahoo also has something similar to Search Insights. So there's lots of data out there that can be available essentially in real time. But you look at the government agencies, well, they do a very, very good job. They're constructing these series using lots of historical data, but they haven't been able to draw on these technological advances that we're familiar with as consumers. So I think we're going to see some interesting developments in economic statistics of trying to incorporate this real-time data into the government reporting and trying to do the kinds of things I just described of getting a better estimate of the current state of the economy, the nowcasting, by using this real-time data. So there's a lot to be done and a lot of other techniques to explore. So thank you.